the books which came before the Quran, Allah gave them names. That one was called the Torah. This one was called the Zabur. That one was called the Gospel or the Injil. Why does this one not have a similar name? What's the difference? Why is this one called a recitation? Why is this one given the name a recitation, Quran? And why is it that the very first revelation that comes down tells us to recite? Iqra. Recite. Bi-ismi rabbik, with the name of your Rabb. Clearly, the obvious answer to that question is that we have a primary obligation to recite this book. That's the first thing we have to do. That is the answer to the question. We have to recite this book. No other book that came from Allah, none ever had this status. Only this one. So clearly the recitation of this book has a role to play in history, particularly in Akhirul Zaman. I'm talking about the recitation. I'm not talking as yet about the study of the book. I'm talking about the recitation of the book. It has a role to play, particularly in the end time, because this is the last book from Allah. If you do not recite this book, therefore, how can you study the book? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us something about the method of studying the book. They don't like to hear this in Washington and London and Paris and in Jerusalem. The arrogant, godless world that is waging war on this book. They don't like it. He speaks in Surah Al-Waqiyah, and this is what he has to say. And listen to the last words. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. فَلَا أُقْسِمُ بِمَوَاقِعِ النُّجُومِ, and I take an oath by the positions in which the stars are located. وَإِنَّهُ لَقَسَمٌ لَوْ تَعْلَمُونَ عَظِيمٌ, and this is the mother of all oaths. This is an oath or a qasam of supreme importance. وَإِنَّهُ لَقَسَمٌ لَوْ تَعْلَمُونَ عَظِيمٌ إِنَّهُ لَقُرْآنٌ كَرِيمٌ فِي كِتَابٍ مَكْنُونٍ. This is a noble and a generous recitation which is located in a book. This is a noble and a generous recitation which is located in a book which is protected. So what's the message? Answer, that you cannot study this book other than the way you study the stars. You have to study the connection between this star and that one, and that star and that one. That's the way you study this book. And now listen to the last piece. لا يمسه إلا المطهرون. You believe with your PhD from Oxford you could study this book? Or your PhD from Temple University you could study this book? All the think tanks in Washington, you think you could study this book? Allah says, لا يمسه إلا المطهرون. You cannot even touch this book, Allah is saying, much less to study it. You can't even touch it, much less to study it. This is not physical touch. This is not ayah muhkama. This is ayah mutashabiha. Unless you are pure and clean in the heart. And purity, insofar as this book is concerned, is that you must have faith in the book and you must be faithful to the book. You can't say, no, I can't say what is in this book. They will call me a terrorist. They will put my name on a no-fly list. My business might collapse. I came to Britain for money. I didn't come to Britain for Islam. I can't do that. Your heart is unclean. That's right. And if your heart is unclean, you cannot study this Quran. You can't even touch it. And so this book has a role to play. You think Pakistan could get out of the mess in which it is with a PhD from Oxford? Only the Quran can take Pakistan out of the mess with a capital F. Mess with it is only the Quran. And who will study the Quran? To take the guidance of the Quran out of the Quran, it will be those who are reciting the Quran in order to study the Quran. So now let us begin with Allah's blessed name. Surah Al-Qiyamah of the Quran. And this is what Allah says. وَإِذَا قَرَأْنَاهُ فَاتَّبِعْ قُرْآنَهُ. And when it is the first person plural, but I will use the first person singular, so it'll hit harder. When I have recited the Quran, you must follow that way of recitation. This is in the Quran. When I have recited the Quran, you must follow that way of recitation. What is that way of recitation? That we have to recite it that way. And if we recite it the way that Allah recited it, what will the Quran do for us? Can it change our hearts so that we can recite Surah Al-Fatiha and blow and he's cured?